I'm Heidi Grunebaum, the new director of the Center for Humanities Research, and I'm delighted to preside as chair over today's celebration of this new volume, Love and Revolution. Today's launch marks the first of a number of planned launches for the volume. Love and Revolution in the 20th Century Colonial and Postcolonial World is published by Palgrave Macmillan, and the editors can share with us plans for the volume going forward. But for this first launch, hosted by the CHR, we're seeing it as a celebration that honors many long friendships, networks of collaboration, as well as graduate teaching and institutional partnerships, all out of which the volume has emerged. So while the great 20th century revolutions have been studied in many different contexts, and this is a point made in the preface to the volume, the turn to love or to affect in relation to revolutionary movements and moments in historical scholarship has not happened yet in a sustained or major way. And this volume stands as an example of a first kind of serious sustained intervention into to the work that coupling of love and revolution do to one another. Stated then as a question, what does the coupling of revolution and love do for understanding politics and for understanding political subjectivity, both in the present and in the afterlives of emancipatory, anti-colonial and anti-capitalist struggles? And what conceptual outworkings the volume asks or compels us to ask might become available when that question around politics and political subjectivity is launched from the thick presence or the thick contemporary of former colonial and post-colonial settings, as the failures, disappointments and dashed hopes of anti-colonial and anti-capitalist struggles bear down with various effects and intensities. Where do affective phenomena evoked by struggle, desire, and hope go? Where do they go to live and where do they go to die? How are they loved and how are they unloved? And which subjects, loved or unloved, were always already excluded from the emancipated collective to come? The editors will reflect on the itineraries of the workshops and conferences that culminated in the publication of the book, with contributing authors who we welcome across various constraints of time zones and times of day. And I hope that this consideration will also allow us to think how postgraduate teaching and the institutional settings out of which this collaboration and the volume emerged have intersected with, shaped and sharpened the concerns of the book. So a celebration would be an appropriate mode in which to mark the appearance of Love and Revolution for many reasons then. The first workshop inaugurated an experimental model, in my understanding, and in some ways an experimental model of collaborative work. And in some ways, while drawing on existing intellectual networks and collaborations, also took seriously insights gleaned from postgraduate and undergraduate teaching. And one example is the anecdote in which the disconnect between anti-colonial nationalist narratives or national liberation narratives and revolutionary politics have been disconnected from the forms and modes of popular culture produced in revolutionary times. And this disconnect was, in the anecdote shared by editors, was discerned in the classroom. The inaugural workshop in Cape Town, hosted by the CHR in 2010, marked the start of a cumulative process as the inquiry reconvened across different sites and spaces, which allowed for a recalibration of its concerns, as well as a deepening and sharpening and extension into the nooks and crannies of the couplings, unthought and unanticipated openings. So without more words from me, I'd like to introduce the panelists and the order in which they'll speak. Patricia Hayes is a National Research Foundation and South African Research Chair in Visual History and Theory at the Center for Humanities Research at UWC. She's published extensively on history and colonial and documentary photography in Southern Africa, and is editor of most recently published anthology called Ambivalent, on visibility in African histories, on visibilities and invisibilities in African histories. G Arunima, who is joining us from India, is professor in the Center for Women's Studies at Jawaharlal Nehru University, a long-standing friend, visitor, and interlocutor of the CHR. G Arunima has researched and published on both historical and modern contexts in India, focusing particularly on cultural, visual, and material texts, as well as rethinking the politics of the contemporary. Pedro Monaville is Assistant Professor of History at New York University in Abu Dhabi. His research interests include the history of decolonization, political imagination, youth movements, higher education, and state violence, as well as the study of memory work and post-colonial history writing. His current book project focuses on the role of student activism in the DRC, the Democratic Republic of Congo. And Mallarika Sinha is Assistant Professor at the Center for Women's Studies at JNU University in New Delhi. Her research monograph is titled Gender and Radical Politics in India, Magic Moments of Naxalbari, 1967 to 1975. And she has co-edited Displacement and Citizenship, Histories and Memories of Exclusion, published by Tulika Books in Delhi in 2020. Her research interests include social movement studies and ethnography and oral history, gender and political violence, as well as gender and theater and history and politics of South Asia. And last, but certainly not least, is Premesh Lalu, who's a founding director of the Center for Humanities Research and has recently been seconded to take up a post at the Sharjah Africa Institute from January 2022. Lalu's second book, Sensing Post-Apartheid Freedom, is currently under review at Polity Press in the UK. So in that order, I'm going to ask Patricia Hayes to begin today's launch.
Thank you very much, Heidi. And I'm quite glad to go first. This is an impossible task to acknowledge everybody and try to give some sense of the enormity of this process that we have gone through that's led to the emergence of the book, Love and Revolution. So I'm going to focus a little bit on the background. You know, for those of you who have read the introduction, we say that the inception of Love and Revolution came from the ground up, from a classroom at UWC, and Heidi has just reiterated this. It certainly did. It started with teaching undergraduates in African history, trying to convey to students in the South African post-apartheid temporality the depth and extent of crisis of expectation of our fellow Africans around the continent. And there was another influence behind the emergence of Love and Revolution as a kind of project, which was an earlier series of workshops that we held called War and the Everyday, which tried to address the concerns of a number of doctoral students working on liberation movements in the subcontinent, and liberation movements and their limitations and their aberrations. Now, we'd found that bracketing together less obvious pairings yielded more questions and critical possibilities, really breaking away from nationalist master narratives. So we decided to launch Love and Revolution, and this was at a time when Premesh Lalu at the Center for Humanities Research had negotiated a partnership with the University of Minnesota and University of Fort Hare, which was supported by funding from the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation. So this was became part of the infrastructure of our workshop series. Now, many of us had also come fresh from Martina Rika's workshops in Cairo at the American University of Cairo, which had constituted some extremely important networks. And this is what brought Professor G Arunima Anu to our first workshop. So between these moving parts, the workshop series took off, and it moved between Cape Town, Minneapolis, New Delhi, and again Cape Town between 2010 and 2012. Now, in total, over 60 papers were presented, and all of these were submitted in advance and read, and every panel had discussants. So extremely intensive work. Now, there were over 60 papers presented, and though only 11 authors had made it into the final book, the conversations with everybody who participated have really underpinned, informed, and even been siphoned directly into the publication. And I'm just going to run through the titles of the chapters and as a way of introducing some of the authors to you. I'm not going to read them out. I'm just going to let them come on the screen, if that's okay. We can ask questions later. Now, just to perhaps give some sense of the initial ideas that moved us, I want to actually read from our different calls for papers as they chart some of the inspirations and difficulties we faced, as well as suggesting how we built on each successive workshop. So for the first workshop in Cape Town, which was accompanied by a pre-conference workshop for PhD students called Show Us Your Archive, the call for papers says, Love and Revolution, this conjuncture of themes arises from a consideration of history in which different movements and epistemologies have been folded over one another in hitherto unacknowledged ways. In Southern Africa, for instance, popular cultural expressions in the midst of nationalist struggles since the 1960s suggest the transformation of individual subjectivities in the midst of political struggle and social change. There are deployments of revolutionary language to express the personal, and discourses of affect to lay claim to the political and the economic. Taken together, however, Love and Revolution goes beyond this to provide opportunities to question the dominant categories of analysis and track the production and organization of knowledge within the subcontinent and beyond. The thematic conjuncture interrogates the underpinnings of the nation, shifts in consciousness of the self and the other, and more radically, the humanities and humanity itself. So we launched with a special focus on Love and Revolution, in which participants were invited to explore with no geographical limitations. As is suggested by some of the author slides, which date from these workshops, there was plenty of revolutionary love going on in and around the workshops. Now, for the second Love and Revolution workshop, which took place at the University of Minnesota, this was called Considering the Limits and Possibilities of Nationalist and Postcolonial Thinking. And it was hosted by the Interdisciplinary Center, ICGC, the Interdisciplinary Center for the Study of Global Change research circle called Transnational Knowledge Production. And these were our partners. Now, their call for papers took up some of the language of the first one, but moved on to suggest or even claim that love is a knowledge-producing event. And there are shared revolutionary texts and affect across territories, oceans, and continents, producing transnational political affective communities. In transitioning from the colonial to the post-colonial, is there a loss of the revolutionary subject? This is asking, do forces such as structural adjustment, neoliberalism, the end of the Cold War, and colonialism bring an end to revolution and maybe love, leaving a sense of abandonment, a nostalgia for retrospectively defined affective bonds, and for the homosocial worlds of resistance? So that was Minnesota. And thirdly, in early 2012, we now moved to India and New Delhi, hosted by women and the Center for Women and Gender Studies at JNU and the Nehru Memorial Museum and Library. And I'm just going to touch on the call for papers here so you can see the kind of emerging currents. So the call for papers says, this series of research meetings is designed to bring the histories and theories of politics and emotion, in brackets, and or affect, into the same analytical frame. Most work has focused so far on the complexities of subject positions within nationalist struggles and revolutions in the second half of the 20th century, and this certainly marked the earlier workshops. Besides drawing attention to these often submerged undercurrents within liberation movements and their histories, there is an increasingly strong sense of transnational affective bonds and shared revolutionary texts and figures across oceans and continents. The latter then seem to present a common intellectual ground, for instance, across South Asia and parts of Africa. Discussions, it says, have also highlighted the way structural adjustment, the Cold War, and neoliberalism have in recent years cast into doubt the ostensible certainties and lost possibilities of these earlier forms of political struggle. This allows scholars to draw upon old questions and rethink them in the light of the challenges of the 21st century. The ongoing love and revolution exchanges have been intensified by the events unfolding in Egypt and elsewhere in North Africa and the Middle East, but remain grounded in research and theorization from different locations, mainly in the global South. In the discussion in Delhi, it says we shall continue to engage with commonalities and dissonances of love and revolution and ask how this might help us re-theorize changing politics in contemporary times. And I really am struck by how this call to re-theorize in contemporary times continues to be absolutely key, and how some of the problems that shaped our debates, have spiraled and increased, and now, of course, surface as a European migrant crisis, for example. The fourth Love and Revolution, which was returned, like a migrating bird to Cape Town, was entitled simply Affective Revolutions. And this iteration in Cape Town was accompanied by the opening of the exhibition Uncontained, which was based on the Community Arts Project art collection, and a wonderful performance by the Handspring Puppet Company of I Love You When You Breathe. It also brought a new cohort of papers and debates under this rubric of affective revolutions. And we were guided, as ever, by the commitment to address what some of our participants in Delhi talked about as the dark side of our social times, and which we need to continue in whatever ways we can muster. Now, I'm not going to go on for a long time. There are 5 speakers, so I simply want to thank my fellow editors, Anu and Premesh, for their stamina, their company, their humor, their brilliance, and their aesthetic and political sensitivities and sensibilities that have sustained me in so many ways. I thank all the authors for their dedication and their trust, and I thank all the participants. And of course, I also wish to thank the University of Minnesota, especially Karen Brown, and Helena Poland McCormick. I wish to thank University of Fort Hare, who joined us on this journey. Deep thanks to JNU and the colleagues who were at the NMML in Delhi. And I also wish to give a really resounding thank you to our wonderful Lamise Lalkan at the CHR, who made everything possible and enjoyable for us. So I leave you there. Thank you.
Thanks, Patricia. I think that that kind of already lodges a celebratory kind of flash of light for us in what we can agree are complex, dark times in dark sides of our contemporary social times. So thank you for that. I'd like to invite Anu, G Arunima.
Thanks, Patricia. Thanks, Heidi. As was decided earlier on, we thought we would actually take this launch as an opportunity to, acknowledge so many different kinds of deaths, intellectual, intimate, personal friendships, camaraderies, shared libraries, discussions. One of the most vibrant things I thought of all the 4 Love and Revolution workshops, and also the winter schools that happened either alongside or at different times, which kind of fed off the Love and Revolution of the winter schools in Cape Town, were the numbers of texts that we read. And I think it forced us to actually think across political and disciplinary contexts in ways that were probably not something we had envisaged earlier. I would certainly say that the first Love and Revolution, which was, I think, an intense 2 or 3 days of discussions, brought together senior and younger scholars in ways that I had rarely seen happen in anything other than feminist conferences in India, which is to say it was entirely non-hierarchical. And there was a wonderful way in which graduate students were intellectual interlocutors and were producing new ways of thinking about so many subjects that are critical to our times, alongside senior scholars who probably had been thinking about at least some of these issues for some time. But what the workshops also did was that it shifted away our focus from written text to visual and oral and other kinds of contexts. And in that sense, I would say Patricia's work has been extremely germinal for all of us to think with, to think beyond, to think about ways of theorizing any number of things, political, aesthetic, but also ways in which we theorize the visual itself. And I think that was the kind of, for me, the biggest takeaway from these workshops. The specificities of the essays are, it's impossible in a launch of this kind to actually summarize the excitements of each of these texts. They are all quite wonderful. And I would strongly urge all friends to read the book, not only because we brought this out, of course, because of that too, but also because each of these essays are actually so important in ways in which they gesture towards fractures and shifts and dissonances. So they don't actually, the coupling of Love and Revolution is not something that's done either in a lazy way or an easy way. So I think there's something about the volume that actually keeps shifting us from one kind of set of ways of thinking about these issues to others. And as Patricia said right at the outset, there were so many different papers that were presented, almost 60 in all these 4 workshops, which is an astoundingly large number of really stellar work. In the midst of that, I do want to remember a very close friend who's no longer with us, Malati Dialvis. Mala is an old friend from a very long time ago and a close friend of many of us here. We lost Mala earlier this year to cancer, but Mala's presence, particularly in the Delhi workshop and also in the Cairo workshops organized by Martina Rieker, were extremely important and really helped us think about criticalities about gender and violence in ways in which, and also about disciplinary questions that a self-reflexive anthropologist asks, which I think was a very important corrective to many of us who might come from other kinds of disciplinary formations. And it really made us rethink. So I do want to take a minute to think about Mala here. And finally, even as so many of our discussions in Love and Revolution were indeed about love and revolution, and there were many times in the years when we were having the workshops and of course subsequent years in which many of our parts of the world were literally falling apart, when I did really dream of a time when something different could have happened. In fact, the 2011 Minnesota workshop was particularly special because Martina Rieker and I tried to speak to each other and to our political, very varied political context. She speaking from Egypt, which was in the first blush of revolutionary excitement. I from a point of immense fear, which was beginning to start then about a change in India. I must say that paper hasn't seen the light of day, but many of the kinds of themes that we were thinking about did actually show us that authoritarianism, repression, and the destruction of dissent has become a very central part of our lives in many of our parts of the world. So not to put a kind of gloomy spin on what is otherwise an extremely exciting moment, I do want to say that this book is exciting also because it dares to speak about love and revolution at a time like this. So let me just stop there and pass it on to Pedro, who will now talk to us about his wonderful essay about Congolese student prisoners and the ways in which it speaks to the volume. Thank you.
Thank you, Anu. I'm very happy to be here, and I'm very happy to also see that volume published. And I came to the conference in 2010 in Cape Town. Was my participation. It was really it was a really important conference for me. The project continued to resonate with me in the years after that, also including in my own teaching. And so I'm grateful to Patricia, Premesh, Anu for putting the book out, and for everybody in Cape Town in 2010. I just wanted to also mention Fernando Arenas, who I met at the conference in Cape Town, and who passed away in 2019. Became a great friend in Cape Town and in the years after. Reflecting on my chapter and in the volume, something I really appreciated about the process of writing that chapter were, I guess, the different opportunities that I had to revisit this text, and so it took some time to be finalized. But then when I look at the text, I also see like I don't know, like the readings that I made over the years that I was able to add to that chapter. There is a very kind of layered dimension to that text to me, and it's that it offered me a good opportunity to kind of also build on a body of work on Kinshasa. The text is partly an attempt at understanding the politics of memory in Kinshasa. There are a lot of colleagues and friends that inspired this chapter. I just wanted to mention a few names: Yolanda Covington, Nancy Hunt, Isabelle de Rezende, Charlotte Grabli, Amandine Loro, Joe Trapido, André Yoka, Thomas Hendricks, Didier Gondola, to just mention some of them. But my what I'm doing in the chapter here is, as Anu mentioned, it was kind of it's a reflection on the history of Congolese students and the repression of the student movement in the Mobutu's years. But it's also a contribution to the study of post-colonial Kinshasa, and this sort of tension between this oppressive history under the Mobutu dictatorship and the liveliness, the energy of popular culture and just of life in Kinshasa. And I guess that's very much how that coupling of love and revolution talked to me in that context. So I'm not going to offer a detailed summary of the chapter. It goes in all kind of directions. It's also kind of a collection of a tapestry of different fragments. I really enjoy kind of just playing with different archival sources there, and connecting photographs, fragments from novels. There's archival documents, letter here as well, references to songs, some rumba songs from the 1960s. But I just wanted to show two images that I reference, and I kind of try to that I discuss in the chapter. Let me share my screen to explain a little bit one of some of the, at least a part of the argument. So that was kind of the starting point of that chapter. It's a graffiti from what used to be underground secret prison in a former cultural center in Kinshasa, the SNF, that I visited just a few, I don't remember exactly, but I think just a few months, a couple of months, maybe before coming to Cape Town, and that was it kind of gave me the framing for the chapter. And that phrase is the title of the chapter. Bolingo ya Kasho eleki bolingo ya libanda. So love is stronger in prison than outside. It's a possible English translation. So I visited that place because a lot of people had told me, about graffitis in that former prison cell, and at the time I was writing about student rebels, student revolutionaries from the 1960s, and some of them had been detained in that prison cell in 1969 and 1971. And so a lot of people told me, yes, if you visit that cell, you'll find graffitis from that time period. And as I mentioned in the chapter, I don't think it's actually that these graffitis are from the 60s or early 70s, but my sense is that they're probably more recent. But that phrase still kind of provided a provocation, an invitation to think about this kind of contradictory or this kind of paradoxical discourse about love and the spaces of love. And so that's what I'm trying to do in the chapter, to these different fragments, different episodes from the 1960s. And so just the other image, and I'm just going to kind of conclude my brief discussion here. But what I I use the phrase Bolingo ya Kasho to sort of circulate through Kinshasa in the 60s and after, in thinking about the connection between issues of personal liberation, emotions, love, and also dreams of revolution. And I end with this painting by my friend Sapa Makengede, who at the time lived in Kinshasa, and worked as a popular painter. And we talked about that, the graffiti from the prison, and I asked Sapan to make a painting about it, and that's the painting he made. I was sort of associating different kinds of images about this thing, and I was surprised, and kind of, I guess I discussed some of the surprise in the chapter about what Sapan decided to do. But and there are different ways to read that painting. But I think I'm thankful for Sapan's contribution here, and this statement about love as fraternity and solidarity, and I guess that's there is this kind of I don't know if resilience is the right term, but kind of I guess a way to kind of go against the idea of a total failure of these dreams of liberation in the 60s at the time of independence. And I think in this painting, a possibility or also an invitation to yes, imagine these spaces of despair, the prison maybe also as a space for the reinvention of new dreams and new ways to live together and love. Yeah. So.
Thank you, Pedro. I would like to invite Mallarika to speak to your chapter in the collection, The Romantic Manifesto, Gender and Outlaw Emotions in the Naxalbari Movement. Go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you so much. First, of course, a big thank you to the editors of the volume. And I must say that I am absolutely thrilled to be part of this book. I'm still reading it. I have started, and I think, I'm learning once more again from the essays that are collected there. I was part of the 2012 Delhi workshop, and it came as an opportunity for me to think about emotion and politics, the way the affective and the political connect with each other at a very opportune time for me, because I was struggling with the ways of conceptualizing social movement studies in relation to affect. Which is not exactly the way social movement studies has evolved in the Indian context. So through the workshop, writing the paper for the workshop was also my way of entering into a new kind of vast, interesting, energetic field of study of affective politics, which actually has helped me a lot in the later years to think about new projects and new ideas. This paper, of course, comes out of somewhat from my doctoral dissertation, some of the themes that I could not include in that. And I guess every researcher knows that when you have the feeling that there are some very interesting conclusions that can be drawn from the material that you already have, but you do not have the right vocabulary to articulate them. So finally, Love and Revolution workshop in Delhi gave me that opportunity to think through some of the material I already had. So to come to the specific paper that I wrote, and as Pedro already has mentioned, that as the years passed by and the way I got the opportunity to reflect on the paper, the comments that came, and I am absolutely thankful to the discussants who were there, the comments that came from the editors, the reviewers, that have been really helpful in shaping the chapter as it stands now. So it began with an exploration of the intense emotional commitment that was part of the Naxalbari movement, which was a Maoist mobilization in the 1960s and the 70s. My field remains in Bengal mostly, where political violence became the mode of achieving that revolution. In this paper, actually, I have tried to focus on the cultural aspects of the political violence committed by the Naxalites, the activists of the movement. This took a very novel form of iconoclasm, which is literally destroying the statues of principally the social reformers of the 19th century, the authors of the Bengal Renaissance, as they were called. And the Naxalites claimed that they have to be replaced by the peasant revolutionaries because they were central in the anti-colonial struggle far more than the middle class urban intelligentsia. Thinking through that, it actually helped me to situate the women participants in the Naxalbari movement and their emotional political commitment to the political philosophy, and to conceptualize that it needs to go beyond the easy binary that has always been used in historicizing Naxalbari movement, where rational political choice is associated with masculinity and emotion or affective commitment with femininity. To to complicate that story, I wanted to think about women's emotional commitment in terms of the political choices they made. It became, in terms of love and revolution, to think through how women's love for revolution shaped their intimate relationships as well as the nature of their activism. This actually also helped me to go into the details of theorizing what can be called outlaw emotions. I, of course, drew from the existing feminist engagements with emotion and affect. And I also drew from the scholarly works that have gone into thinking about the dynamism between body and emotion, especially in terms of the body in pain and how that articulates emotions. And outlaw emotions, the idea of the outlaw emotions allowed me to think about women's romantic love, not in terms of individuals or romantic love directed towards individuals, but romance with the revolution, romance with the idea of the revolution itself. And that also kind of took me into the direction of telling love stories of the revolution, where I could actually finally grapple with the ways in which marriages, living together, and all different other kinds of friendships became possible, transgressing boundaries of caste and race and religion, and very much at the ground level or the grassroots level, as one calls it. And that's where I think, as the introduction of the volume kind of starts with, that from the ground up, the way affect is centered in the popular imagination of revolution helps one to think about the conjuncture between the affective and the political. And that's where gendered emotional commitments to political philosophy became accessible through the framework of outlaw emotions. So I will just stop here, and I will thank once again to the organizers of this launch and to all the contributors. And I look forward to reading all the essays again. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mallarika. Let's go straight to Premesh.
Thank you very much, Heidi and colleagues, and I'm going to be very brief. But I want to just say a few things about, Love and Revolution and the Center for Humanities Research at UWC. I mean, I could not imagine the Center for Humanities Research without the friendship and solidarity formed through 4 conferences called Love and Revolution. And in many ways, Patricia and Anu and Martina invited us into a conversation, as Mallarika and Pedro was saying, that was extremely generative. It set the tone for many, many years, for 10, 12 years of the work of the Center for Humanities Research. And increasingly, when I think about the conferences over the years and the generative ways in which it shaped, conversations in the center, I realized that, many of our students were pointing to very, very important ways to rethink the coupling love and revolution. And there was one particular moment where, the exhaustion with historicist constructions of both love and revolution was presented to us. And it was when Patricia Hayes' students, Okechuku Nwafo, decided that he would write a poem dedicated to an essay that Simona Soni, who is with us here today, translated, an essay by Jean-Luc Nancy called Shattered Love, in which he demanded from Nancy a response to the difficulty that he had experienced in that essay. And in some ways, what I think Oke was asking us to think about was to think a little beyond the ways in which we had thought about love as contained within that dyad, a lifetime of love or a nighttime of love. And instead to ask us to think about the serendipities of love. And so in many ways, the conferences threw up so many important opportunities for graduate students to pursue new directions, to open spaces for many of us to pursue new areas of research, as Mallarika was suggesting. And there are a few colleagues here. I'm thinking here of Ali Rida Khan, and just picking up people who I see on the Zoom chat, whose work on happiness, for example, has picked up on Sarah Ahmed's work and tried to pick up, related back into the themes that have come out of the Love and Revolution conferences and the many conversations we've had on affect and the humanities in post-apartheid South Africa. Fernanda has written on the cinema and the problem of race, and also tried to think, the affective as an important way to reconstruct narratives of race and oppression in South Africa. And there are many others. But in the center, without Love and Revolution, without these conferences, we would not have pursued an inquiry into aesthetics and politics, into the area of aesthetic education, the becoming technical of the human, to name just a few. And so, I want to say that in many ways, these conferences that we've shared so much over the years that these conferences really did set a tone for the CHR at UWC and brought us into conversation with colleagues across the continent, but more importantly, across hemispheres. And so, I recall with great fondness that meeting that we had at the Nehru Memorial Library, and the ways in which, so many of the questions that had been left unattended in the kind of moment of post-colonial despair and disappointment suddenly were available to us. And again, gave us an opportunity to proceed in rethinking the humanities and the university in relation to a shared space that students and faculty had created at each of our institutions. So I want to thank Patricia and Anu and all the contributors, colleagues at the University of Minnesota in the ICGC, Gary Minkley at Fort Hare, the Saatchi Chair in Social Change, and colleagues in the Center for Humanities Research, in particular Lamiz Lalkin, who took us on that memorable boat ride. We tried to reach Robben Island, which we didn't because the stormy seas prohibited that. And I'm looking forward to the next installation of conferences and wondered what thematic we might propose after Love and Revolution. So colleagues, thank you very, very much. And to Anu and Patricia for helping to bring us into a space of thinking these important questions 10, 12 years ago. I think it's really proven to be phenomenally generative. Thank you.
Thanks, Premesh. I would like to invite Patricia and Anu to respond to Pedro and Mallarika's presentation, if you would like to.
Thank you very much, Heidi. I'm so, it's so wonderful to hear both Pedro and Mallarika talking about that moving from one framework of thinking to another through the process of taking your research, coming to a workshop, engaging in the conversations, and then going through the process of drafting, rewriting, revising. I had no idea it was so positive. I'm so thrilled. Because I think that after the workshops, which brought together so many things that in a way are impossible to process. The actual task of doing a book allows you to ruminate and ponder more deeply. And I have to say that the editorial exchanges and the dialogues that each of us as co-editors have had with our groups of authors that we've been responsible for have just unpacked all these possibilities over and over again for me personally. So it's continued to be very, very exciting all the way along. And so I let me leave it there. I'm just going to share some photographs of some of our friends who we now miss, but who were with us for part of the journey. Anu mentioned Mala, who is here pictured in Delhi, and Pedro mentioned our dear departed friend, Fernando Arenas, who passed away, I think it's now 2 years ago in Minnesota. And we also have our friend, Jeremy Sylvester, who died recently from COVID. And there are no doubt others, but just to take a moment to remember our dear friends and their beautiful ideas. Thank you.
Thanks, Patricia. I think it's a very beautiful tribute and extends the extent to which these kinds of complex, long collaborations are also labors of love of various forms. So thank you for that.
I just want to say that, you know, I have had the good fortune of sharing with particularly Mallarika a lot of her work over this last decade. I have learned enormously from her work, particularly the significance of gendering ways in which we study revolutionary politics. There's such or sort of inscribing it with a different kind of way of engendering it. I mean, it's gendered in a very masculine way. She reverses the logic of that. And that creates very different ways of thinking what revolution means. And that has been enormously enriching experience for me. And so this essay I see as also a tribute to that journey that at least I have had with her, other than the fact of what it brought to the Delhi conference and the Delhi workshop and the kinds of really exciting discussions that actually happened at that time vis-a-vis her presentation and many of the others that day, which spoke to very similar kinds of concerns. And I also think that, you know, one of the most sort of subtly beautiful things about Pedro's work is the fact that he brings to the fore the importance of thinking homosocial and homoerotic intimacies, what could possibly be homoerotic intimacies, in the context of what is actually a really you know, fraught political context, the prison. And I have thought a lot about this essay, and I've returned to it now that I myself am trying to write about them. And so both of these are contributions that are very rich, and they make us think, and they prod us to go beyond the kind of expected ways of thinking about love and revolution and think in other kinds of ways. Thanks.
Thank you, Anu. Perhaps then I could ask the speakers to perhaps reflect on, well, firstly, I think it would be really interesting to hear how the editors and contributors are imagining the book to travel, where it can be taken up, how its arguments might be engaged, the kinds of settings and forums for that engagement. And perhaps I could turn it back to you with that question.
So I think that this platform is the first opportunity of, I don't know, it's like we're all coming back to the soil and turning it over again. And that is a really wonderful feeling. You know, we've been very isolated in our respective compartments and nations in the last 2 years. So it's you know, it feels in a way quite shocking to suddenly have the opportunity of connecting in this transversal way. I'm just looking at Mallarika's beloved face, and I'm so happy to see her, and Pedro as well. I think that there's a new cohort of young people who are emerging, and many of whom actually are present with us. And because we've taken so long to do the book, there's a bit of a kind of generational gulf, I think, that has emerged, and some of the practices we engaged in and the attempts to be very rigorous by asking for papers in advance, which could be read by discussants. And I think Anu has spoken really beautifully about the way there's this interleaving between younger and older scholars. And I apart from the energy and the originality of our young colleagues, I really want to thank our senior colleagues as well. Many senior colleagues who came so generously and shared many, many gems with us and responded in the most comradely way to our events. So there's a kind of practice which is both rigorous but very supported, that I think is very important to hold on to. And I want to reassure those amongst us who are at the early stages of their career, or they're still doing their research theses, to actually know that you are embraced and there is a community, and it's not confined to one little institution. It travels across the world. I think people would notice how this notion of shared libraries and shared texts, and then a growing kind of aesthetic impetus took Love and Revolution in many directions. And you know, there was a sort of unpredictability to that. We could never know this is where we are going to, but every single encounter has left a deep sediment. And in fact, as we try to argue in the introduction, it's those little sediments and deposits that have been left behind by those who went before that we can pick up and carry forward. So even in the face of enormous difficulties. I look forward to seeing what the next book launch will look like. I think that will be very exciting. And, you know, a luta continua.
Thanks, Patricia. Go ahead, Premesh.
Well, you know, I think that the point I was trying to raise about the way in which Love and Revolution enabled the conversation, not only across, you know, hemispheres, but also across different, you know, levels of engagement with the academy and the public sphere and public institutions, is a model that we must hold on to. And so something about, you know, what we've inherited from the process of Love and Revolution needs to be taken forward. And perhaps, you know, the one thing that I've been thinking about, particularly as we've rounded up, you know, as we round up this part of the project, is that there was a way in which the hardening sensibilities of nationalism became a target of much of the critique of the book, and many of our students from War in the Everyday, through the series of conferences on Love and Revolution, were suggesting a discomfort, were pointing to a discomfort with the ways in which we appear trapped in these hardening kind of narratives of war and violence. And we're trying to find other ways to talk about war and violence. And so, the way in which the census became a particularly fertile site for kind of engaging those hardening narratives of nationalism and, and violence is something we ought to take seriously. And perhaps, a reiteration of the process that we've gone through now might lead us to a deepening of the conversation of, what the census might do for us in this moment, in this conjuncture.
Thanks, Premesh. No, I think you're putting down an important challenge, as is Patricia, and in different ways, Anu and Pedro and Mallarika. And I do wonder what Love and Revolution Unrequited might look like. So if there's appetite for that, particularly at the current conjuncture where hardening nationalisms are taking forms that were not necessarily anticipated 10 or 20 years ago even. And so those kinds of new constellations, fragmentations and new constellations, coalitions and alliances of new forms of nationalism, populist nationalism that I think we have emerged, that we've viewed with some horror emerging over the past few years, require a kind of return to thinking into the problem while opening it up through various kinds of other modes and iterations. And I think the senses, I think the aesthetic is an incredibly important way. And I think, Patricia, you've in the kind of genealogy of the project that you laid out so carefully for us when you opened the session, reminded me of the extent to which public institutions, and particularly the arts, and I'm thinking about the various exhibitions that were engaged not as kind of illustrative supplements to the work of the workshops, but actually as constitutive of the intellectual terms of the workshop. So I just want to acknowledge and affirm that we continue to work and experiment with this model that you've given us after 10 years of work.
Just to add very briefly, one of the issues that came up in the last few years, particularly from the CHR and also in all our contexts, is the crisis of the humanities and the kinds of stresses on the public university. And I think this is an issue we do need to think about very carefully and seriously at a time when we speak about a volume like this, because it makes the possibility of similar work actually really very challenging. And I think we need to embrace that challenge head on and think about ways of how we go beyond that, taking it on in important political ways. I will not use that highly celebrated term, neoliberal term, which the capitalists love, creative. But, I think it's very, very important to think about what this crisis does mean for the likes of us, who for the most part are located within the university. And I am thinking also about how people like Premesh have moved to other kinds of cultural texts, the theater, for instance, puppetry. and the ways in which those become sites for thought. And I think there is something about thinking about the arts generally and what that invitation is. So let me just leave it there. Thanks.
Thank you, listening to all of you, and to kind of build on what Patricia, Premesh, and Anu have already said, that I think the articulations of love for an institution, for the nation, for one's own community, have taken various routes, even if I'm thinking only about India. And that really have put us in multiple crossroads of different kinds of crisis. That how does one actually think about the definitions of love, romance, intimacy, and commitment, and overall the ways in which the body itself circulates through them, is something which really one really needs to think about it. And increasingly I can see that the way populism itself is being theorized in terms of affective and emotional ways of articulating politics. So I guess there is a turn in the way Love and Revolution is shifting. And that may not be a very comfortable sight to think about all the time, but I think that it needs attention. And I guess from here onwards, we can start building on that. And thank you for giving the book to build on something which is already there. Thank you very much.
Beautiful. Thank you. Pedro, would you like to have a last word? And I see that there are so many well wishes from friends far and wide and other contributing authors. And it's really it's wonderful to see.
Yes, thanks, Heidi. And so, yeah, just want to thank again everybody involved with the project and the editors, but also the launch today. And I mean, my kind of I guess we're personally, but I'm hoping also not only personally, but one of my hope for this book is that yes, it continues to generate thinking also about teaching, as Patricia and Premesh also mentioned at the beginning, and certainly that's something I like to the way that I like to use this book, and particularly because of all this. Yes, I mean, there's already been mentioned, but all of these articulations, crossroads and encounters, but Love and Revolution, of course, but also just the regional, all this, for me, the biographical, the visual, also like dimensions in the book are really important. And so yes, I'm kind of I'm excited to use that as a teaching resource.
With that, colleagues and friends across different time zones, thank you for joining this wonderful celebration. I too hope it can be in person, and we look forward to hearing details about the next launch event.